The camera pans to a grand, glittering ballroom, the epitome of luxury and sophistication. Crystal chandeliers hang from the high ceiling, their light refracting into shimmering rainbows that dance across the polished marble floor. The air hums with soft classical music, punctuated by the clinking of crystal glasses and the murmur of conversation among the city's elite. Dressed in tailored suits and sequin gowns, the attendees embody power, wealth, and privilege. Their laughter and polished manners create a veneer of perfection, one that masks an undercurrent of judgment and competition. At the center of this opulent gathering stands Ethan Cole, a dashing billionaire in his late 20s. Ethan's sharp features, chiseled jawline, aquiline nose, and piercing blue eyes are complemented by his tall, athletic frame. His tailored black tuxedo fits him perfectly, exuding effortless elegance. His tousled black hair and confident posture command attention, radiating an aura of authority and charm. Yet, tonight, his focus is not on the glittering chandeliers or the adulation of his peers. Instead, his gaze is fixed on someone unexpected. In the shadows of the ballroom, near a gilded column, stands Aisha, a timid maid who clutches a silver tray of drinks. She is a stark contrast to the extravagant world around her. Her caramel-toned skin glows softly under the golden light, her wide brown eyes filled with a mix of awe and apprehension. Loose tendrils of her dark, wavy hair frame her delicate face, and her simple uniform, a crisp white blouse and black skirt, seems almost out of place in the sea of designer gowns. She shifts nervously, her fingers tightening around the tray as if it's the only thing tethering her to reality. Aisha doesn't notice Ethan at first, too preoccupied with maneuvering through the crowd without drawing attention. But Ethan notices her. He's been watching her all evening, captivated by her quiet grace and the way she seems untouched by the pretensions of the room. To him, she is a breath of fresh air in a world that often feels suffocating. The crowd begins to notice Ethan's gaze, their whispers growing louder as he starts walking toward her. The conversations falter, replaced by a ripple of murmurs. Is he really walking toward her? What could Ethan Cole want with one of the maids? This is absurd. He's making a spectacle of himself. Ethan ignores the growing tension, his stride purposeful and his expression unwavering. Each step he takes feels heavier, more charged, as the room collectively holds its breath. When he finally stops in front of Aisha, she freezes, her tray trembling slightly in her hands. "Aisha," he says, his voice low and steady but loud enough for the crowd to hear. She looks up at him, her wide eyes meeting his piercing blue ones. Time seems to slow. Then, without hesitation, Ethan lowers himself to one knee. Gasps ripple through the room like a shockwave. Crystal glasses nearly slip from stunned hands. "Will you marry me?" Ethan's deep voice cuts through the stunned silence like a knife. The tray slips from Aisha's trembling hands, clattering onto the floor with a metallic crash. The sound jolts her, but she remains frozen, her mind racing. Her heart pounds in her chest, drowning out the whispers and murmurs that rise around her. Her lips part, but no words come out. This is a mistake," she finally stammers, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's gaze never wavers. His voice is firm, filled with conviction. "No mistake. You're the one, Aisha." The room erupts. Whispers escalate into full-blown exclamations. Some guests gasp in disbelief, while others mutter furiously under their breaths. The elites exchange scandalized glances, their perfectly composed faces betraying a mixture of outrage, shock, and fascination. Across the room, standing near a grand archway, Ethan's family watches the scene unfold. Margaret Cole, Ethan's mother, radiates fury. Her steely gray eyes narrow dangerously, her perfectly coiffed hair barely moving as she clenches her diamond-studded clutch like a weapon. Her emerald green gown, which screams power and sophistication, contrasts sharply with the venom in her expression. Beside her stands Liam Cole, Ethan's older brother. His sharp cheekbones and slicked-back hair give him a cold, calculating air. He adjusts the cuffs of his tailored suit, a sneer curling at the corner of his mouth. Margaret's voice is low but dripping with venom as she leans toward Liam. "This girl is not one of us. She will destroy everything we've built." Liam's lips curl into a smirk. "He's humiliating us in front of everyone. We can't let this happen." Aisha, meanwhile, feels the weight of 100 eyes boring into her. Her cheeks burn as judgmental stares pierce through her like daggers. Every whispered comment feels like a blow, every sneer a reminder that she doesn't belong. Yet, amidst the noise and chaos, her tear-filled eyes lock with Ethan's. His gaze is steady, unwavering, and filled with a sincerity that cuts through her fear. She takes a shaky breath, her chest heaving as she tries to find her voice. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she nods. The room erupts again, this time with a cacophony of reactions. Scattered applause comes from a few sympathetic souls, but they are drowned out by the audible outrage of others. "Unbelievable!" a woman exclaims, her voice dripping with disdain. "This is a disgrace to the Cole family," a man mutters, shaking his head. Margaret, unable to contain her fury, turns sharply on her heel. Her heels click against the marble floor as she storms out, her emerald gown billowing behind her. Her parting words echo through the room like a final blow. "This will ruin us, Ethan. Mark my words." Liam follows close behind, throwing one last scornful glance at Aisha before disappearing through the grand doors. The crowd begins to disperse, their curiosity sated, though the air remains heavy with tension. Aisha stands rooted to the spot, her heart pounding louder than the chaos around her. Her hands tremble at her sides, and she feels as though she might collapse under the weight of it all. But then Ethan rises to his feet. He reaches out and gently takes her hand in his touch warm and reassuring. "You're safe with me," he whispers, his voice low but firm. His words, simple as they are, carry a weight that steadies her trembling frame. For the first time that night, Aisha allows herself to believe him. The scene fades to the stunned faces of the remaining guests, the glittering chandeliers above reflecting the fractured atmosphere of the room. A month had passed since the grand, controversial proposal that shocked the elite social circles. Aisha, now Mrs. Ethan Cole, found herself living in a world that felt like both a fairy tale and a nightmare. The sprawling Cole mansion with its towering marble columns, sprawling gardens, and countless gilded rooms was a palace of dreams, but to Aisha, it was a gilded prison. Her life before the whirlwind romance had been simple, defined by quiet resilience and hard work. She had been used to rising before dawn, scrubbing floors, and smiling through exhaustion. But here, among the mansion's pristine halls and sparkling chandeliers, her identity as a maid seemed like a cruel irony. She was now drowning in designer dresses she didn't feel comfortable wearing, etiquette lessons that left her head spinning, and icy stares from the household staff she once considered her peers. The staff whispered behind her back as she walked past. She could hear snippets of their conversations, the judgment in their voices cutting through her like shards of glass. "She was one of us just weeks ago. Now she thinks she's a queen. How long do you think this marriage will last? She's clearly not cut out for this life." Even Margaret Cole, Ethan's imperious mother, didn't bother to hide her disdain. Each interaction with her was a test of endurance. Margaret's sharp tongue delivered veiled insults with surgical precision, her words dripping with contempt. At breakfast one morning, Margaret had gestured toward Aisha's hand as she struggled to pour tea gracefully. "It's ironic, isn't it? Those hands used to carry trays so effortlessly, but now they tremble over something as simple as a teapot." Ethan, sensing Aisha's discomfort, had stepped in to defend her. "Mother, enough," he'd said sharply, but Margaret had merely raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. For Aisha, Ethan was her only refuge. Despite the suffocating expectations of his family and the public eye, he remained her anchor. They shared stolen moments of laughter in the mansion's quieter corners, where the weight of judgment couldn't reach them. It was in these moments that Aisha glimpsed the man behind the fortune, a man who was weary of the pretense and shallowness of his world. One evening, as they sat on the mansion's veranda, Ethan reached for her hand. His touch was warm, steadying. "You remind me of what matters," he said, his blue eyes soft with affection. In this world of smoke and mirrors, you're the only thing that feels real. Aisha smiled, but her heart was heavy. Ethan's love was a bomb, but it couldn't erase the growing cracks in their perfect facade. The tension escalated during a family dinner. The dining room was a masterpiece of opulence, with its long mahogany table adorned with crystal candelabras and fine china. Aisha sat beside Ethan, her posture stiff, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The conversation flowed around her, polite and shallow, until Margaret decided to strike. Clearing her throat, Margaret placed her wine glass down with a deliberate clink and addressed the room. "I've hired a private investigator," she announced, her voice calm but laced with steel. Aisha's breath caught in her throat. Her fork slipped from her hand, clattering onto her plate. The sound echoed in the tense silence that followed. Ethan's brow furrowed, his gaze darting between his mother and Aisha. Margaret's cold, gray eyes locked onto Aisha, her lips curling into a thin smile. "If there's anything in your past you've hidden, my dear, rest assured, we'll find it." Aisha's heart pounded in her chest, the blood rushing in her ears. Did Margaret already know something? Was this a threat or a warning? She felt exposed, like a deer in the sights of a predator. Ethan's voice broke through her panic. "What is the meaning of this, Mother?" he demanded, his tone sharp. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her expression serene. "It's simply due diligence, Ethan. You may trust her implicitly, but I don't. This girl has secrets. When I uncover them, you'll thank me for saving you from a mistake." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. "Aisha is my wife. If you can't respect her, you're not welcome here." Margaret's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing more. The rest of the dinner passed in strained silence, the atmosphere so thick with tension that Aisha could hardly breathe. Later that night, unable to sleep, Aisha stepped out onto the balcony of their bedroom. The cold night air bit at her skin, but she barely noticed. Her tear-streaked face was illuminated by the moonlight as she leaned against the railing, her thoughts racing. The past she had worked so hard to bury seemed to claw its way to the surface, threatening to unravel everything. Behind her, the sound of the door opening startled her. She turned to see Ethan stepping onto the balcony, concern etched into his features. His black pajama shirt hung loosely on his tall frame, his tousled hair catching the faint silver light. "Aisha," he said softly, stepping closer. "What is it? What are you so afraid of?" She turned away, her fingers gripping the cold metal of the railing. "You wouldn't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Then help me understand. Whatever it is, we'll face it together. But I need you to trust me." Aisha hesitated, her heart warring with itself. She wanted to confide in him, to unburden herself of the secrets that had haunted her for years. But the fear of rejection, of being seen as unworthy, kept her silent. She finally shook her head, her voice barely audible. "Some secrets are better left buried." Ethan exhaled slowly, his hand falling to his side. "You're not alone anymore, Aisha," he said gently. "Whatever happens, I'm here. Just don't shut me out." Aisha nodded, but the weight of her secrets pressed down on her like an anchor. Ethan lingered for a moment longer before retreating back inside, leaving her alone with the night. The days that followed were marked by a growing sense of unease. Aisha couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret's investigator was closing in on her past. Every knock on the door, every unfamiliar face on the estate, sent her heart racing. She felt like a fugitive, constantly looking over her shoulder. Ethan, sensing her anxiety, tried to reassure her. He planned surprise outings to distract her, picnics in the garden, late-night drives along the coast, but the shadow of Margaret's threat loomed large. Aisha's smiles grew increasingly forced, her laughter hollow. One afternoon, as Aisha wandered the estate's library, she overheard two of the staff whispering. "Did you hear? Mrs. Cole's investigator found something." "Really? What is it?" "I don't know, but whatever it is, I'm sure it'll shake things up around here." The blood drained from Aisha's face. She quickly slipped away before they could notice her, her mind spiraling. What had they found? Was her past about to be exposed? That night, as she sat alone in the bedroom, The weight of it all became unbearable. She pulled out an old photograph from a hidden pocket in her suitcase. The image was worn and faded, showing a younger version of herself standing beside a man with weary eyes and a crooked smile. Her father, the man who had made choices she couldn't erase. Tears blurred her vision as she clutched the photograph to her chest. She had worked so hard to escape the shadows of her upbringing, to build a life defined by more than the mistakes of her family. But now, it felt like those shadows were creeping back, threatening to consume everything she had fought for. When Ethan returned from a late meeting, he found Aisha sitting on the edge of the bed, the photograph in her hands. He paused, taking in her tear-streaked face and the pain in her eyes. "Aisha," he began, his voice filled with concern. She looked up at him, her resolve wavering. "Ethan, if you knew everything about me, I don't think you'd still love me." He crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling in front of her and taking her hands in his. "Don't say that. I love you, Aisha. All of you. Whatever this is, we'll get through it together." But Aisha couldn't shake the doubt gnawing at her. Margaret's investigator was closing in, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. And when it did, she feared it would destroy the fragile world she and Ethan had built. For now, she could only wait, and hope that love would be enough. The morning sun rose over the sprawling estate, casting a golden glow on the carefully manicured gardens and the grand Cole mansion. It was the day of the wedding, a day that should have been filled with joy and celebration. Yet, as the household bustled with preparations, an undercurrent of tension simmered beneath the surface. Aisha woke early, her nerves jangling like frayed wires. She tried to calm herself as she stared at the simple but elegant gown hanging by the window, the sunlight catching its delicate lace details. But before she could even begin to prepare, the door to her room flew open with a force that made her jump. Standing in the doorway was Margaret Cole, her steely gray eyes blazing with cold fury. In her perfectly manicured hands, she held a thick manila file. Margaret didn't bother with pleasantries. She strode into the room, the heels of her shoes clicking against the polished wood floor like a countdown to doom. Slamming the file onto the vanity table, she turned to Aisha, her lips curling into a venomous sneer. "You thought you could hide this, didn't you?" she hissed, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through steel. Aisha's heart plummeted. Her hands trembled as she reached for the file, already dreading what lay inside. She flipped it open and was greeted by a series of photographs that made her stomach churn. There she was, years younger, dressed in ragged clothes, standing outside a dilapidated shack. Beside her stood a man with weary eyes and a hardened expression. Her father. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "That's my father." Margaret didn't let her finish. She reached into the file and pulled out another document, a police report. "And this," she snapped, thrusting the paper toward Aisha. "Your father was arrested for fraud. He stole from innocent people, ruined lives. Your family name is a stain, and you dared bring it into ours?" Tears welled up in Aisha's eyes, but she forced herself to speak. "He didn't steal for himself. We were starving. He was trying to keep us alive." Margaret's laugh was cold and mirthless. "Spare me the sob story. Whatever his reasons, the fact remains. You're a liar, just like him. Did you think you could marry into this family and erase your past? Did you think you could fool us all?" Aisha's voice broke. "I never lied about who I was." Margaret leaned closer, her presence suffocating. "Maybe not outright, but omission is just as deceitful, my dear. You knew this would destroy you, yet you said nothing. And now you've brought disgrace upon us all." With that, Margaret turned on her heel and stormed out of the room, leaving Aisha clutching the damning file. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed in her ears as her vision blurred with tears. She sank to the floor, the weight of her father's mistakes, and her silence, crushing her. Hours later, the grand chapel buzzed with anticipation. Guests filled the pews, their murmurs blending into a low hum of excitement. The lavish decorations, white roses, crystal candelabras, and golden accents were a testament to the Cole family's wealth and status. At the altar stood Ethan, looking impossibly handsome in his tailored tuxedo. His expression was calm, but his blue eyes searched the room, eager for the moment he would see Aisha walk down the aisle. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, Aisha stood frozen in her dressing room. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, her wedding gown a stark contrast to the turmoil in her heart. Her mind replayed Margaret's words, the photographs, the police report. She felt like an imposter, a fraud standing on the edge of being exposed. A knock at the door startled her. "Aisha, it's time," a soft voice called from the other side. She took a deep, shaky breath. "You can do this," she told herself. "Ethan loves you. He'll understand." Summoning every ounce of courage, she stepped out of the room and made her way toward the chapel. The double doors swung open, and a hush fell over the crowd as she appeared at the end of the aisle. Ethan's face lit up with a smile, his love for her evident in every line of his expression. For a moment, Aisha felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could weather this storm together. But that hope was shattered the moment Margaret rose from her seat and stepped forward, her presence commanding attention. She held the same file she had shown Aisha earlier, her movements deliberate as she made her way to the altar. The guests exchanged confused glances, their whispers growing louder. Ethan frowned, his gaze shifting between his mother and Aisha. "Mother, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice laced with irritation. Margaret ignored him. She turned to the crowd, her voice ringing out with cold authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, before this charade continues, there's something you all need to know about the woman my son intends to marry." Aisha froze, her blood turning to ice. Margaret opened the file, holding up the photographs for everyone to see. Gasps rippled through the chapel as the guests took in the images of Aisha's past. "This," Margaret announced, her voice dripping with disdain, "is the real Aisha. A liar. A fraud. Just like her father, who was arrested for theft and fraud." The murmurs grew louder, a wave of disbelief and judgment washing over the room. Aisha felt their eyes on her, felt the weight of their scorn pressing down on her like a vice. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor and escape the humiliation. Ethan's face was a mixture of shock and confusion. He turned to Aisha, his blue eyes searching hers for answers. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice quiet but heavy with emotion. Tears streamed down Aisha's face as she nodded. "Yes, but..." Ethan took a step back, his expression shifting to one of betrayal. "Why didn't you tell me?" She opened her mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come. The judgment in his eyes, the disbelief, it was too much. Before she could muster a response, she turned and fled, her gown trailing behind her as she ran down the aisle and out of the chapel. Outside, the cool evening air hit her like a slap. She stumbled down the steps, her vision blurred by tears. She could still hear the murmurs from inside, the whispers that would haunt her for years to come. Her chest heaved as she gasped for breath, the weight of her shame suffocating her. She didn't know where she was going. All she knew was that she couldn't stay. She couldn't face Ethan, couldn't bear to see the disappointment in his eyes. She ran until her feet ached, her heart pounding as she vanished into the night. Back in the chapel, chaos erupted. Guests whispered furiously, their curiosity mingled with shock. Ethan stood at the altar, his fists clenched at his sides. He turned to his mother, his voice sharp and cold. "What have you done?" Margaret didn't flinch. "I've saved you from a lifetime of regret. You deserve better than a woman with a tarnished past." Ethan shook his head, his jaw tightening. "You had no right to do this. You had no right to humiliate her like that." But Margaret remained unmoved. "One day, you'll see that I was protecting you." Ethan stormed out of the chapel, his mind racing. Aisha was gone, but he couldn't let her go. Not like this. That night, Aisha found herself at the edge of the city, sitting on a bench in a dimly lit park. Her gown was stained, her makeup smudged, but she didn't care. She stared at the stars, her mind a whirlwind of regret and despair. She had always known her past would catch up to her, but she hadn't expected it to happen like this. As the wind rustled through the trees, she clutched the pendant around her neck, a small keepsake from her father. It was all she had left of him, a reminder of the sacrifices he had made. "I'm sorry, Papa," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I tried to leave it all behind. I tried to be better. For the first time in years, she felt truly alone. And as the night stretched on, she wondered if she would ever find her way back to the life she had lost. Weeks had passed since the disastrous wedding day, and Ethan Cole was a man consumed by regret. The memory of Aisha running down the aisle, tears streaming down her face, haunted him relentlessly. Every morning, he awoke with the same gnawing thought. I should have believed her. His once perfect world now felt empty, a hollow shell of wealth and prestige without her. Unable to move forward, Ethan poured his energy into a desperate search for Aisha. He hired private investigators, scoured every corner of the city, and followed every lead, but she seemed to have vanished into thin air. Meanwhile, Aisha had retreated to the only place that felt remotely like home, the slums where she had grown up. The neighborhood was as she had left it, run down and forgotten by the world, with its crumbling buildings and narrow, crowded streets. She returned to the same broken-down house that had sheltered her during her childhood, a place full of painful memories but also the only place where she felt she could start over. Inside, she found solace in caring for her younger brother, Samir, who was just 10 years old but bore the weight of a frail, ailing body. His illness, a chronic condition that required constant care, had been Aisha's secret burden all along. It was why she had worked tirelessly as a maid, scrubbing floors and sacrificing her own dreams to provide for him. Now, she was back at his bedside, singing softly to soothe him through another feverish night. Ethan's search finally led him to the slums. He had followed a slim lead from one of the investigators, who claimed to have seen a woman matching Aisha's description in the area. Dressed inconspicuously, Ethan walked through the crowded streets, his heart pounding as he approached the address he had been given. The house was small and dilapidated, its paint peeling and its windows cracked. Ethan hesitated at the door, unsure of what he would find on the other side. Gathering his courage, he knocked gently. Inside, Aisha froze at the sound. Her heart raced as she debated whether to answer. But before she could decide, the door creaked open, and there he stood, Ethan, looking haggard yet determined. His blue eyes, usually so confident, were now filled with desperation and longing. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything that had happened hung between them like a storm cloud. Then Ethan's gaze shifted to Samir, who lay pale and weak on the worn-out mattress. His heart broke at the sight. Aisha, Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. Why didn't you tell me? Tears welled up in Aisha's eyes as she struggled to find the words. Because I was ashamed, she finally said, her voice trembling. I didn't want your world to look down on me or on him. She gestured towards Samir, her protective instincts flaring. I thought I could keep it hidden, that I could somehow belong in your life without dragging this part of me into it. Ethan knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he reached for hers. You didn't have to hide anything from me, Aisha. I would have understood. I would have helped. But instead, you let me believe. He stopped, his voice breaking. You should have trusted me. Aisha pulled her hand away, her expression conflicted. How could I trust you when your family was waiting for me to fail? When your mother was digging into my past, just waiting to find something to destroy me with? I thought if you knew the truth, you'd look at me the way they do. Ethan shook his head, his voice firm. I don't care what they think. I care about you. He reached for her again, his touch gentle. And I care about him. Their moment of reconciliation was interrupted by the sound of slow clapping. Both of them turned toward the doorway, where Liam Cole stood, leaning casually against the frame. His expression was smug, his eyes gleaming with malice. Touching, Liam drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Really, it's like something out of a bad romance novel. Ethan rose to his feet, his jaw tightening. What the hell are you doing here, Liam? Liam stepped inside, his polished shoes looking out of place on the cracked floor. He smirked as he glanced around the small, shabby room. Just wanted to see what all the fuss was about. You've been running yourself ragged looking for her, and I had to see for myself what was so special about this little setup. Aisha glared at him, her fists clenched. Get out. But Liam ignored her. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document, waving it mockingly. You know, it's funny. Mother thinks she's the one who uncovered your dirty little secrets, but the truth is, he leaned closer, his smirk widening. I planted them. Aisha's eyes widened. What are you talking about? Liam's tone turned cold. Those photos? The police report? I paid someone to dig up dirt on you. Mother may have been the one to blow it all up at the wedding, but I made sure she had the ammunition. I couldn't stand the thought of you weaseling your way into our family and taking what's mine. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. His voice was low and dangerous. You did this? You destroyed us for your greed? Liam shrugged, unbothered by the fury radiating from his brother. You've always been Mother's favorite, Ethan. The golden boy, the heir to the empire. And then you had the audacity to bring her into our lives. He sneered at Aisha. I couldn't let that happen. I won't let you ruin everything we've built. Aisha's breath caught in her throat. The room seemed to spin as the weight of Liam's confession sank in. Everything, the humiliation, the heartbreak, the shattered trust, had been orchestrated by him. Ethan took a step forward, his fury barely contained. You selfish bastard. You didn't just hurt me. You didn't just hurt her. You've destroyed everything we could have had, everything I've ever wanted. Liam's smirk faltered for the first time, but he quickly masked it with bravado. Oh, spare me the lecture. You'll thank me one day when you realize I saved you from a colossal mistake. Ethan lunged at him, grabbing the front of Liam's jacket and shoving him against the wall. You think this is a game? You think you can just manipulate people's lives and walk away unscathed? Aisha stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. Stop, Ethan. He's not worth it. Ethan hesitated, his breathing ragged, before releasing Liam with a shove. Liam adjusted his jacket, his smirk returning. I'll leave you to your little reunion, but don't think for a second that this changes anything. You'll come crawling back to the family, Ethan. You always do. With that, he walked out, leaving a tense silence in his wake. Ethan turned to Aisha, his expression softening as he reached for her hand. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice thick with emotion. For everything. For not seeing through his lies. For letting you down. I should have fought for you. Aisha looked at him, her tears finally spilling over. I didn't think you'd believe me. I thought you'd leave me like everyone else. Ethan shook his head, his grip on her hand tightening. Never. I love you, Aisha. I've loved you from the moment I met you, and nothing Liam or my mother can do will ever change that. Aisha searched his eyes, finding only sincerity. Slowly, she nodded. I love you too, Ethan. As they embraced, Samir stirred on the bed, his small voice breaking the moment. Aisha, who is he? Aisha smiled through her tears, pulling Ethan closer. This is Ethan, she said softly. He's the man who's going to help us start over. And in that moment, surrounded by the broken pieces of their lives, they found hope again. Together, they would rebuild, stronger, wiser, and unshakable. The Cole mansion was unusually quiet, its grand hallways devoid of the usual hum of activity. Ethan stood outside the doors to his mother's study, his jaw clenched, his fists tight at his sides. The events of the past weeks had left him teetering on the edge of fury, and now he was ready to confront the person who had played a pivotal role in tearing his life apart. Without knocking, he pushed the doors open. Margaret Cole sat at her imposing mahogany desk, dressed impeccably in an emerald green suit. Her sharp gray eyes narrowed as they landed on her son. Ethan, she said coolly, leaning back in her chair. What brings you here so early? I assume you've come to discuss something important? Ethan didn't mince words. Did you know? He asked, his voice low and tense. Did you know that Liam was the one who planted those photos and that police report about Aisha? Margaret's expression didn't change, but a flicker of recognition crossed her face. A flicker that didn't escape Ethan's notice. She sighed, straightening her posture. Yes, she admitted. I knew. Ethan's hands slammed down on the desk, making the papers on it jump. You knew and you let it happen? You let him destroy her, destroy us, just to protect your precious reputation? Margaret's calm facade cracked slightly as she rose to her feet. I didn't condone Liam's methods, Ethan, but I won't apologize for trying to protect this family. Aisha was never going to fit into our world. You were blinded by your infatuation, and I had to intervene before you threw everything away for a girl with nothing to offer." Ethan shook his head, his blue eyes blazing with anger. "You keep saying this is about protecting the family, but it's not. It's about you. It's about control. You couldn't stand that I was making decisions without your approval, so you tore apart the one thing in my life that truly made me happy." Margaret's face hardened. "I've spent my life building this family's legacy. Everything I've done has been for you and Liam. I won't let you jeopardize it because you can't see the bigger picture." Ethan stepped back, his voice calm but filled with resolve. "You don't care about family, Mother. You care about power. You care about keeping us all under your thumb so you can play queen in your little empire." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. Ethan took a deep breath, his next words steady and deliberate. "I'm done. I'm leaving the business. Aisha, and I don't need your money, your approval, or your name. You can keep your empire, but you'll lose your son." Margaret's eyes widened, the weight of his words finally sinking in. "Ethan, don't be ridiculous. You can't just walk away. This family, this company, is your birthright." Ethan shook his head. "I don't want it. Not like this." He turned and walked out, leaving Margaret standing alone in her study, the weight of her choices settling heavily on her shoulders. The tension in the Cole family reached its peak later that evening during a hastily called family meeting. The dining room, usually a place of grandeur and formality, now felt like a battleground. Margaret sat at the head of the table, her composure restored but her eyes wary. Liam lounged in his chair, his smirk firmly in place, while Ethan stood at the other end, his presence commanding the room. "Why are we here?" Liam asked lazily, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "If this is another one of Ethan's self-righteous lectures, I'd rather not waste my time." Ethan ignored him, placing a folder on the table. "We're here because it's time the truth came out." Liam's smirk faltered slightly as he eyed the folder. "What truth?" Ethan opened the folder, pulling out a series of documents and photographs. "The truth about you, Liam. About what you did to Aisha." He held up the damning evidence: bank transfers to a private investigator, emails detailing the smear campaign against Aisha, and even an audio recording of Liam bragging about his actions. The room fell silent as the weight of the evidence sank in. "You planted the photos. You fabricated the police report. You manipulated Mother into thinking she was protecting this family, all because you couldn't stand the thought of me being happy." Ethan's voice was calm, but his anger was palpable. Margaret's gaze snapped to Liam, her expression one of disbelief. "Is this true?" Liam shrugged, his bravado faltering. "So what if it is? I did what needed to be done. Aisha was a liability, and Ethan was too blind to see it." Margaret's face darkened. "You went behind my back. You lied to me." "Oh, don't act so innocent, Mother," Liam shot back, his tone defensive. "You wanted her gone just as much as I did. I just made sure it happened." The room erupted into chaos. Margaret and Liam argued furiously, their voices rising as accusations flew back and forth. Ethan stood silently, his gaze fixed on the documents in his hands. Finally, he slammed the folder shut, silencing the room. "Enough," he said firmly. "This isn't about the company or the family legacy anymore. This is about who we are, what we've become." He turned to Liam, his expression cold. "The company will survive without you, Liam. But our family won't." Liam's smirk returned, though it was weaker now. "And what are you going to do about it, Ethan? Walk away and play house with your little charity case?" Ethan's response was calm but resolute. "Yes, I am walking away. Because unlike you, I know what matters." With that, Ethan left the room, leaving his mother and brother to stew in the aftermath of his revelations. Ethan returned to the modest apartment where Aisha and Samir had been staying. The tension that had weighed on him for weeks lifted the moment he stepped inside. Aisha looked up from the small dining table where she was helping Samir with his homework, her face lighting up when she saw him. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Ethan crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. "It's over," he said softly. "I'm done with them, Aisha. It's just us now." Aisha's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they were tears of relief. "You mean it?" Ethan nodded, his blue eyes filled with determination. "I mean it. I'm not going to let them control our lives anymore. We'll start fresh, together." Samir looked up from his notebook, his small voice breaking the moment. "Does this mean you're staying with us forever?" Ethan crouched down to Samir's level, a warm smile on his face. "Forever," he promised. "We're a family now." The next few months were a whirlwind of change. Ethan sold his shares in the family company, using the proceeds to fund a community center in the neighborhood where Aisha had grown up. The center provided healthcare, education, and job training for families in need, a far cry from the corporate boardrooms he had once inhabited, but infinitely more fulfilling. Aisha, too, found her purpose in the work, using her experiences to connect with the families who came through the center's doors. Together, she and Ethan built something meaningful, a testament to their resilience and love. Back at the Cole mansion, the fallout from Ethan's departure was profound. Margaret found herself questioning the choices that had driven her family apart, while Liam's tarnished reputation left him isolated and bitter. The empire Margaret had fought so hard to protect now felt hollow, its foundation cracked. But for Ethan and Aisha, the future was bright. Their love had been tested and proven unbreakable, and they had emerged stronger, wiser, and more united than ever. As they stood hand in hand outside the community center, watching children play in the courtyard, Ethan turned to Aisha. "We may not have the Cole fortune," he said with a smile, "but we have something better." Aisha squeezed his hand, her heart full. "We have each other. That's all we need." And as the sun set on the horizon, their new life truly began. Months had passed since Ethan walked away from the Cole empire, choosing a life of purpose over one of wealth and power. Together with Aisha, he had turned a dream into reality. A community center in the heart of the slums where healthcare, education, and opportunities were offered to families who had been overlooked by society. The building itself was modest but welcoming. Painted in warm, vibrant colors, it stood as a beacon of hope amidst the crumbling surroundings. Inside, the sounds of laughter and learning filled the air. Children played in a small courtyard while their parents attended workshops or received medical care in the clinic. The walls were decorated with murals painted by local artists, each one telling a story of resilience and community. For Aisha, the center was more than a project. It was her second chance. She moved through the bustling space with ease, her smile radiant as she helped a mother fill out forms for school enrollment or comforted a crying toddler. Her experiences, once a source of shame, had become her greatest strength. She knew what it was like to feel invisible, to struggle, to fight for survival. And now, she used that understanding to connect with the people who walked through the doors. Ethan, too, had found his place. Gone was the corporate suit and tie. Now he wore simple clothes that allowed him to roll up his sleeves and get to work. Whether he was repairing a broken chair in the center's classroom or organizing donations for the clinic, he threw himself into every task with enthusiasm. His once cynical outlook on life had been replaced with a deep sense of fulfillment. In the small apartment they now called home, the changes were just as profound. Samir, Aisha's younger brother, was thriving. With access to proper medical care and a nutritious diet, his health had improved dramatically. He no longer spent his days confined to a bed. Instead, he attended school for the first time in his life. Every evening, he would excitedly show Ethan and Aisha his homework, his wide smile a constant reminder of why they had chosen this path. One night, as they sat together at the dinner table, Samir looked up from his plate. "Do you think one day I could help at the center too?" he asked, his voice filled with hope. Aisha reached across the table to take his hand, her eyes glistening with emotion. "Of course you can, Samir. You can do anything you set your mind to." Ethan smiled, ruffling the boy's hair. "You're already an inspiration, buddy. I think you'll be running the place one day." News of the center's success began to spread, even reaching the upper echelons of society. Articles were written about that fallen billionaire who had turned his back on fortune to uplift the less fortunate. Ethan and Aisha's story inspired many, sparking donations and support from unexpected places. But it wasn't the headlines or accolades that mattered to them. It was the lives they were changing, one person at a time. One afternoon, As Aisha was helping a group of children with their reading, she noticed a familiar figure standing hesitantly at the entrance. Margaret Cole looked out of place among the brightly colored walls and bustling activity, her tailored dress and pearl necklace a stark contrast to the surroundings. She clutched her designer handbag tightly, her expression uncharacteristically uncertain. Aisha's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she considered pretending not to see her. But then she took a deep breath and walked over, her posture calm and composed. "Margaret," Aisha said, her voice steady. "What brings you here?" Margaret's eyes darted around the room, taking in the sight of children laughing, parents chatting, and volunteers working tirelessly. Her usually sharp features softened, and for the first time, Aisha saw something she had never expected: humility. "I wanted to see for myself," Margaret admitted, her voice quieter than usual. "I've heard about what you and Ethan have built here. It's remarkable." Aisha nodded, unsure of what to say. Margaret hesitated, then looked directly at her, tears glistening in her eyes. "I was wrong about you, Aisha. I judged you unfairly. I let my pride and fear blind me to the kind of person you are." Aisha felt a lump rise in her throat. For so long, she had carried the weight of Margaret's disapproval, and now, hearing these words was both overwhelming and freeing. She took a deep breath, her voice soft but firm. "Thank you for saying that. It means more than you know." Margaret nodded, her tears spilling over. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I hope we can find a way to move forward. For Ethan, for the family." Aisha studied her for a moment, then reached out and placed a hand on Margaret's arm. "I forgive you," she said simply. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do to make things right." Margaret's shoulders sagged with relief, and for the first time, a fragile peace was formed between them. Later that evening, as the sun set over the slums, Ethan and Aisha stood hand in hand outside the center. The golden light bathed the courtyard in warmth as children played, their laughter filling the air. Parents stood nearby, chatting and sharing stories, their faces glowing with hope. Ethan turned to Aisha, his blue eyes filled with admiration. "Look at what we've done," he said, his voice tinged with wonder. "None of this would have been possible without you." Aisha smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "It was always possible, Ethan. We just had to believe in it." He squeezed her hand, his voice soft but resolute. "You taught me what wealth really means. It's not money or power. It's this." He gestured to the scene before them. "It's love, compassion, and second chances." Aisha nodded, her heart full. "And it's ours to share." As the camera panned out, the scene shifted to show the vibrant life surrounding the center. Children's laughter echoed, families hugged, and a community once forgotten now thrived. Slowly, a caption faded in, "True wealth lies in love, compassion, and second chances." And as the screen faded to black, their story remained, a testament to the power of redemption, resilience, and the belief that even the most broken lives can be rebuilt with love.